Hello guys, my name is Maestro. Welcome to the Full. Today we're talking about why Russia is attacking Ukraine and how this affects us as Africans. So on February 24, 2022, Russia sent missiles into Ukraine, first bombing some airports and military headquarters, and later brought in tank troops from Crimea and allied country Belarus. But just about 2 weeks ago, the United States, or as we all know, America, had warned Ukraine about this, which Russia denied. And so, it was quite a surprise when the world woke up to hear the news of airstrikes in Ukraine from Russia, starting a war. People have labeled Russian President Vladimir Putin as the new Hitler. But what is actually the cause of this war? Well, it doesn't only start now, or about 2 weeks ago. It starts as far back as 2014 and even further. Let's get right into it.
So, Russia is a transcontinental country whose landmass spans between Eastern Europe and Northern Asia. Russia, together with some 15 neighboring countries, including Ukraine, used to be known as the Soviet Union, which collapsed in 1991, after which Ukraine became independent. Because of this, Russia and Ukraine have a lot in common. About 1/3 of every Ukrainian is ethnic Russian, and 1/3 of every Ukrainian speaks Russian as their local dialect. Let's briefly talk about NATO. NATO stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was established in 1949 after the Second World War to promote cooperation and peace in all Europe in the context of countering the threats posed by the then Soviet Union, now Russia, whose behavior at the time was a source of concern for all the countries involved. Its original 12 members includes the United States of America, the United Kingdom, Belgium, Canada, Denmark, just to name a few. Today, it has about 30 members. NATO commits its allies to democracy, individual liberty, and the rule of law, which are all generally considered as Western ideologies. NATO also sets out the idea of collective defense, which means that an attack on one member state is an attack against all allies. So basically, these countries came together to join their militaries to form one military union that could withstand the Soviet Union. Today, however, the Soviet Union does not exist anymore, and yet more and more former Soviet members keep joining NATO, with the exception of Ukraine and a few others. Now, after the Second World War, in an attempt to unify East and West Germany by the Soviet Union and the West, the precondition was that NATO would not extend into Eastern Europe and thus not harm Russian interests, which was agreed. This agreement today, however, has been denied severally by the West. But if it's anything to go by, then it's safe to say that Russia was betrayed by the West, given NATO's current extent at the moment. But why did Russia not want Eastern European countries to join NATO, and why was it trying to prevent them from doing so? First of all, NATO professes itself to be a military defense organization, although Russia highly doubts this, but sees NATO as both defensive and offensive, usually citing the war between Serbia and Kosovo as an example where Serbia was not a NATO or European Union member, and yet NATO involved itself in the conflict in the name of defending innocent Muslims. Russia again does not only see NATO as a military alliance, but also as a cultural project that attempts to westernize member countries with their Western ideologies. As we all know, the West is more about democracy, freedom of speech, human rights activism, etc. Russia, on the other hand, do not have quite a good record in granting of those liberties and seemingly does not want to have anything to do with it. Furthermore, for the simple fact that NATO can be considered generally anti-Russian, given the fact that it was established as a military alliance that could withstand the Soviet Union, when the need arose, whereas Russia was trying to maintain its influence as a superpower in Eastern Europe, and in fact established a counter-initiative known as the Warsaw Pact with its former Soviet members in an attempt to keep them by its side, although most of the countries later on still abandoned this initiative for NATO. In addition, Russians have always been obsessed with their borders. This, according to many geopoliticians, is due to the sort of landscape which they have, which is mostly plain and can make quite an advantage for an enemy in times of war. They also claim that being part of the Soviet Union helped provide some solution to the problem, but with Russia standing on its own today, it leaves them with no other choice than to attempt to control what goes on around their borders and thereby try to dominate other countries as a means of preventing them from being used by foreign powers against itself. Now, although the West sees this obsession as baseless, to them there will always be another Hitler who tried to invade Russia, Napoleon, etc. But why do the countries also want to join NATO? Well, obviously, they prefer to align themselves with Western ideologies or with the West. But again, they also fear the situation of Russia taking them back in the past and repeating some of the Soviet-era agonies to them. Why Ukraine? You see, Ukraine is not the only one to have suffered such problem at the hands of Russia. Georgia and Moldova have all had their fair share of this problem. So, given the previous betrayal from the West in the context of NATO's expansion, it seems quite obvious that Russia is simply trying to draw the line at Ukraine, as it had previously warned that NATO's expansion would have some consequences. In 2021, Russian President Vladimir Putin took the pains to write out a very long piece about how Ukrainians and Russians are literally one people. In this piece, he also said that Ukraine was built by the former Soviet Union and was now being used as a puppet of the West. Why now? Possibly because the war in the East is going nowhere, and this was just a simple change of strategy on the part of the Russians. Let's briefly explain the war in the East. To the east of Ukraine, in two regions, namely Donetsk and Luhansk, which are also Russia-Ukraine border towns, quite a good number of the people there have been noted to be pro-Russian, which is quite understandable because they share border with Ukraine, and therefore there would be some form of intermarriages and crossing over to both sides. In 2014, however, there were pro-Russian anti-government protests in those areas during which these Russian-backed separatists seized government buildings in the regions, leading to an armed conflict with the Ukrainian government. Although they eventually declared themselves the Donetsk People's Republic and the Luhansk People's Republic respectively, the conflict had still been going on till now. This happened around the same time that Russia annexed Crimea, the southernmost town in Ukraine, which was once a gift from the Russian government to the Ukrainian government. The conflict, however, seemed to be frozen in time as no one was making any progress, neither the Ukrainian government nor the separatists. Ukraine, on the other hand, had been making significant progress in its attempts to join NATO. So it looks like Russia simply decided to change its strategy and attack. But what does Russia seek to gain from these attacks? Well, Russian president has claimed that he intends to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine, although analysts beg to differ as there have not been any recent reports of military or Nazi activities in Ukraine, and in fact, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is actually of Jewish descent. Analysts believe that his intention is to topple the current government and replace it with a more Russian-aligned or more or less puppet government, as current president has always been known to be an open critic of Russia and its ways. Since 2021, Moscow issued a list of demands on which it was willing to negotiate, which included a ban on Ukraine joining NATO, returning NATO's forces to where they were stationed in 1997 before an eastward expansion, recognition of Crimea as Russian territory, and Donetsk and Luhansk as the republics they have declared themselves to be. That Russian should be the second official language of Ukraine, with laws prohibiting its abolishment, demilitarization of Ukraine, and abolishment of any weapons that would threaten Russia's security, and banning ultra-nationalist parties and organizations in Ukraine. But what has NATO been doing about the whole situation, and the West too? There have been talks going on almost a daily basis. Unfortunately though, the only talks that have yielded any results so far is the agreement for safe passage for civilians. Although both countries claim to be making significant progress, NATO, however, made it clear on the onset of this war that it had no plan of sending combat troops into Ukraine itself, although some member states have sent some help in the form of weapons, etc. The European Union also sent some field hospitals, and NATO forces was activated for the first time. There have been rumors, though, that there is an infiltration of American soldiers in the midst of the Ukrainian soldiers who are relatively inexperienced in the face of the Russian army. Again, sanctions have been slapped left and right. Russian banks have been taken off the SWIFT system, which is an international system of money transfer. The European Union, United Kingdom, and Canadian airports have all been blocked to Russian airlines. There have been talks about giving out properties of Russian oligarchs or billionaires, Ukrainian refugees. Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline project between Russia and Germany has also been halted. Russian biggest newspapers, Sputnik and Russia Today, have all been banned in the European Union. Many multinational companies such as Apple and Coca-Cola, etc., all halted their services in Russia. Social media networks like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, on the other hand, were blocked by the Russian state for limiting access to information. YouTube, however, has also blocked Russian state media. Russia will no longer be hosting this year's Champions League, and Grand Prix will no longer take place in Sochi this year. The United States President, Joe Biden, is also making efforts to move closer to Saudi Arabian oil, as a ban has been placed on Russian oil, and about 3 million Russians are estimated to suffer economically from all these sanctions. But what impact is this having on Africa? We are already aware of the refugee situation at the moment, and in total, more than 2 million refugees have already fled the country, which obviously includes a lot of Africans. African countries are still struggling to get its people out of there as quickly as possible. As we all know, a lot of Africans like to visit Eastern European countries for academic purposes, but now their education has been halted due to the war, and countries like Ghana, who had already evacuated a little over 200 citizens, are already making arrangements for alternative academic opportunities for its students. We are also aware of the discrimination going on at the borders between Ukraine and its neighboring countries, and parents back home in Africa are worried about their kids. Again, our African leaders might be forced to take sides because of the opportunities they might stand to gain or lose, although there is currently a general leaning towards non-alliance, which in the past could have spelled dire consequences for the countries involved. One of the issues of most concern is oil prices, since Russia produces about 10% of the world's oil. Oil prices have started shooting up and is predicted to go higher if care is not taken, which is a disturbing factor of all this, because it has always had a domino effect on the prices of transportation and subsequently prices of nearly all products. And so, in general, prices of goods and services might go up in most African countries. Again, the amount of international aid to be received within this time frame would also be affected, as more of it would rather be channeled to Ukraine, which is also in crisis at the moment. In fact, the United Nations has already warned that the amount of aid to be received in drought-hit parts of the continent, like Somalia and Sudan, will be limited this time around. Ukraine is also reported to be withdrawing its forces from the United Nations missions in order to assist their home country during this period. So far, no African country has openly expressed their approval for what is going on, and in fact, we can testify that a lot of Africans are concerned and praying for the people of Ukraine. The African Union, ECOWAS, and some individual countries like Ghana, Kenya, and Gabon have already expressed their disapproval at the whole situation. It is quite funny to note, though, that countries like Mali, where Russian troops are helping fight insurgencies, have all been quiet. And lastly, there have been calls that some Russian private military groups in countries like Mali be banned for fears that they might be engaging in some form of clandestine activities, such as providing mercenary aid for the Russian government. Do you think that the West is partly at fault in their actions of admitting Eastern European countries into NATO? Or do you think that Russia's move against Ukraine is justified? Let us hear your comments.